Okay, so everyone at home can hear me too? Okay. All right. So we're here to talk tonight about the PSAT, the SAT, and the ACT. Do you have a freshman, sophomore, junior, senior? Hmm? Sophomore. Okay, perfect. All right. So hopefully, folks in the audience are joining us from all different
I'm gonna
groups.
check to see if we need that for the YouTube.
Really challenging to do this. Okay, so
I'll move it closer.
hopefully everybody who's joining us by live stream is coming from different age groups, but this is pertinent information for everybody. You guys are actually, my friends here in person actually are in a unique scenario in that next year they'll have the digital SAT, but that's a whole nother topic. Don't worry about that for right now. Is that better? Okay. So, my name is Leah Murnane. I'm the market director for New York and Connecticut for the Princeton Review. I have been working for the Princeton Review for 10 years. I started first as a teacher. Prior to that, I had a career working at NYU in administration, and I took some time off. So I know these tests like the back of my hand. I also live on Long Island, and this year I have a freshman in high school. So in just a few short years, he'll be telling me that I don't know what I'm talking about this time. So we were going to talk about a couple different topics. So we have truths and misconceptions about these tests. We want to definitely go over the similarities and differences because there's a lot of confusion about these tests. And of course, I'll give you some help about how you can improve your scores. So the truths and misconceptions, I think probably one of the biggest misconceptions out there right now is revolving around test optional admissions and whether the SAT and ACT even matter, right? So basically, test optional was a movement that was around for a really long time before the COVID pandemic, but then obviously with COVID, students simply could not take these tests. So when that happened, obviously the schools reacted and they made it test optional. And some of those policies have continued on. Some of them were going to continue on. Some of them are temporary policies that started for 1 year, extended a bit. So it's understandable that parents and students and even counselors could be confused about what's going on out there. So we're going to talk about it in a couple different buckets. Just so you know, we put out a book every year, the best 300 and something schools. So we conduct this data. You're probably familiar with this. It's a bestseller. We also give away the best 388 schools or whatever. Each year there's a different number on our website. So we do a lot of information, polling all these schools, talking to students at these schools. And we decided to actually poll them on where they fell this year in terms of test optional. So there's actually 4 different possible buckets that we can talk about in terms of whether test scores are required or not. It's very confusing, but I'll try to make it as simple as possible. Test required, what do you think that means? Yes, tests are required, easy one, right? Test flexible is a little confusing. Test flexible means that they do require some tests, but not the SAT or ACT. This one we don't have to worry about that much. It really applies mostly to like the U of C system, so California. Test optional is the one we all are familiar with hearing recently. Test optional means that tests are not required, but you may submit them. And if you do submit them, they will look at them. They'll consider them as part of your application. Test free means they absolutely are free of testing. They will not look at test scores. Okay, so of these 4 categories, if you had to guess, what percent of schools are requiring tests right now? What would you say? 20. Good guess. Anybody else have another guess?
I was going to say 32.
Okay, so actually right now, only 6% of schools are requiring tests. Okay. The rest, test flexible, teeny weeny, don't worry about this one, 3% of schools. Test optional is 85% of schools. And test free is 7% of schools, okay? So test optional is the word out there, right? And it basically means that you can, from an admissions perspective, apply to a school without including your test scores. The question is, do you want to, right? So when we were conducting these, looking at all these schools to put together our book, we asked them, well, will you still want to see test scores regardless of your policy? They still want to see high test scores if students are submitting them. 93% of schools said that. And if you look at the data of what students are actually doing, the majority of students are choosing to submit test scores. So when you're applying, you have to realize who else is applying and what they're doing. So big misconception out there, it's easier to apply to schools that are test optional. Not necessarily. It's easier to get in? No, right? Basically, more students might be applying, and then the school can become more selective, right? Which means it's actually harder to get in. And this was the reason why schools adopted test optional policies well before the pandemic, because they want to increase their applicant pool, right?
So with the admittance, is it, they're still taking most kids that speak to schools versus kids that don't?
So
What's that ratio?
there's so many different admit rates depending on the school, but the data shows that the students who are submitting their scores are submitting higher test scores. Does that make sense? So then the students who are getting admitted are the best performing students. So, right, they want to see the best of everything, college admissions committees. They want to see the highest test scores, but they also want to see the highest grades and the highest, participation in activities, right? So it's hard to tease that out. So the key thing to keep in mind here is test optional admissions should be defined as admissions processes that do not require students to submit SAT or ACT scores for admissions consideration, right? But there's other aspects of the application process besides admissions, right? So this doesn't mean, right, it's technically optional for your individual application process if you're considering getting into a specific college at a school, or if you want to get into a specific program, or if you want to get a specific scholarship, right? So just for example, because every single school has a different policy, let's look at Stanford's policies, what they say. Stanford says officially, Stanford will review applications with or without SAT or ACT test scores, leaving the decision in the hands of the applicant. So their policy is we're test optional, right? But it's Stanford. What do you think most people applying to Stanford do, right? And interestingly, on their own freshman application requirements page, they kind of have a little bit of conflicting information. They say standardized testing is one of the application requirements that can highlight academic preparedness. So they're saying that it's optional, but we value test scores, is basically the message. And then obviously they can also lead to scholarships. So what you may not know is that even at schools that are test optional, certain scholarships from those schools require test scores. So certain state funded scholarships, ROTC scholarships, so Army, Navy, Air Force, and then National Merit Scholarship is part of the PSAT process, but it also requires that you take either an SAT or an ACT afterwards in order to receive that scholarship. So just good things to keep in mind. Okay, so now we're gonna play a little game. I'm sorry, I'm gonna keep calling on my faves in the front row. Other misconceptions about the SAT and ACT that we wanna get rid of, right? So I wanna ask you, what do you think standardized tests actually measure, right? Do you think these tests measure your intelligence, true or false? True, okay. False. They do not measure your intelligence. It might really feel like they do though, right? I think we've all been there where we felt like they measure your intelligence because the way they're written is kind of like IQ test, right? But actually they're not a test of your intelligence. Do you think they reflect your high school GPA? Oh, we got dissension among the ranks. Okay, so maybe, right? Actually, they don't. I will tell you, in all the time I've been working for the Princeton Review, that the majority of students who come to me have a GPA between a 95 and 100, right? And they take a practice test, and their scores do not align with their GPA. So these tests are different than what you do in school. What about predicting your college GPA? Do you think that they do a good job of that? No, they don't, right? Because in college, you're going to be studying a specific subject matter, right? What if you choose to be, in the liberal arts, you're not taking as many math courses? The SAT is half math, right? How could that be an accurate predictor, right? And what about, do you think they test what you've learned in high school? Exactly, maybe, right? This is where the jury's out because basically the content of these tests is stuff that you're taking and learning in high school, but the way that these tests deliver that information and test you on that information is different. These tests test you on how well you take these tests, right? Under the guise of the same material that you're learning in high school. So for a comparison, we'll look at high school tests, right? So I'll take my son, for example. Right now he's in geometry, right? When he's in geometry class, it's a limited subject matter. It's only geometry within all of the math, right? And then specifically when he takes a test, it's on one subject of one unit of geometry, right? So he's being tested on his content knowledge. His teacher is giving him plenty of time to take that test. The teacher wants to see what the students have learned because he's teaching them. He wants to make sure they're learning and he wants to adjust accordingly, right? So he's on their side. He's probably giving them partial credit or opportunities for extra credit, right? And he's a human, so he's grading it differently than a machine would. And that one test that my son gets in geometry is just one element of his overall grade. He's got class participation, he's got projects, he's got homework, everything else, right? Well, let's look at that compared to standardized tests. Standardized tests are testing you on years of material. So all the math from like 8th, maybe even 7th grade, right, all the way through to 11th grade. And what helps you succeed is not necessarily always content knowledge, but your knowledge of testing strategies. And you're timed very intensively, right? And it's a right or wrong answer, that's it. The machine is grading it, no special extra credit from your teacher who knows that, you wrote a 6, but you meant a 9 because you showed it all the way through in your work, right? And only the final score matters. So you can see how a student who does really well in school might actually not do really well on these tests, especially the first time they take them. So let's talk about the differences between the tests. So the PSAT, is your son or daughter taking it tomorrow? Yes, okay. So you can tell them tonight, the PSAT is nearly identical to the SAT, so they should get a good night's sleep and they should use that opportunity to practice and see how it feels, right? So the PSAT is actually only 15 questions fewer and 15 minutes shorter than the SAT. So that means it's a really good opportunity for exposure, right, and experience and practice. The PSAT is also scored on a similar scale, and they do that because they want to give students an opportunity when they get their PSAT score to see how they might score on the SAT. So College Board, the makers of the SAT, like to mess with our heads, but in reality, the SAT is scored on a scale of up to 1600, and the PSAT is scored on a scale up to 1520. They like to confuse us, but in the end, whatever score you see on your child's PSAT score report should equate to what they think your child would get when they take the SAT in the spring or at that same time as other students taking it. So the other thing that is important to know about the PSAT is it's the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. So we don't have to worry about the PSAT scores being sent to colleges. But when students take the PSAT as juniors, in their junior year only, they're automatically entered for this National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. They take your reading test score, your writing and language test score, and your math test score, which are all sub-scores of the SAT. They add them together, they multiply them by 2, and they get this magical number that is your National Merit Qualifying score. Okay, so this number just automatically gets calculated every time a junior takes the PSAT. And then those numbers are reviewed, and the top 1% of scores in each state are then national merit qualifiers. Okay, now the National Merit Scholarship is not a huge monetary scholarship, but what it is it's a great recognition to go on college applications. But to give you a sense of how few students actually achieve this, you got 1.6 million juniors taking the PSAT, 50,000 of them are recognized as scholars, 16,000 of them become national merit semifinalists, and then ultimately you've got 15,000 finalists. So it's a very, very, very small pond in the end that you're swimming in. But it is good to know. You have to take, if you think you might qualify, I've actually had some families tell me like, oh, well, she already took the PSAT as a sophomore. We knew she was going to take the SAT the summer after sophomore year, so we didn't bother taking the PSAT. It's like, wow, your daughter's really high scoring. She might have actually qualified for national merit. So it behooves every junior to take the PSAT for this reason, and also for the other reasons that I mentioned, right? After the PSAT, students will have taken a 3-hour test, right? That is just an accomplishment in itself, right? You have to get used to taking these tests because it's the equivalent of like, practicing to run a marathon. It's not the same if you jog a little each day. You got to get out there on a Saturday and really run the whole thing, right? You'll also have seen these style of questions, right? So these questions are written in a strange way. It's different than the tests you take in school, and the more exposure to them you have, the better you will become accustomed to them, the more you'll understand the typical traps that the College Board puts in the answer choices. And then ultimately you get a practice score. Now, many juniors, by the time they get their PSAT scores, it's already mid-December, and they've already got a prep plan, or they might know what they're doing. Some students have already taken real SAT and gotten their scores by the time they get their PSAT scores. But ultimately, it's a good thing to have that practice score to give you a sense of your strengths, your weaknesses, and where you fall. So then people say, well, then what should I do then? Right? How do I know if I should take the SAT or the ACT after I've taken a practice PSAT? So one thing I recommend that sophomores should do at the end or summer after their sophomore year, and that juniors can definitely do summer between, or like that first fall couple months right now, is also take a free practice ACT. We have one available on our website. Taking a practice test is something that can allow you to see how you may score without having those scores count. And in doing that, you will be able to get a sense of the differences between the tests. And I'll go into those a little bit in a minute. That might help you make your decision too. But a lot of people ask me, well, shouldn't I just take both? Wouldn't that just help my odds of, getting into school? And that's a good question too. What I say is, see what you think about both tests. Pick one to start with that you think you could perform best on, and planning to take that test twice. If you want to, after that, switch test types, you can, right? Everybody can come up with a prep plan that works with their own timeline, and I'll show you timelines in a little bit. So looking at the similarities and differences between these tests, both tests are 3 hours of testing time. Both tests have multiple choice questions, though the SAT has some fill in the blanks on math. And both are testing you on specific subjects. And the content is similar, but what's different is the way it's delivered. Parents out there might feel the same way I did, that there's a typical style of SAT question. Sometimes students do not like the way SAT words things. The ACT is delivering the same questions with a different, more straightforward wording. However, they get you a bit on time. So it's a little bit of pick your poison. So the ACT has a grammar section, which they call English, a math section, a reading section, and a science section, which is unique to the ACT. Also unique is that they have an optional essay at the end. If you look here, the bottom, I don't know if you can see my screen, but the bottom total shows the number of minutes for the whole test. So you have 215 minutes, but you have 216 questions, right? That doesn't really feel fair, right? That math section alone, 60 minutes, 60 questions. The ACT is definitely pressuring students for time. And the SAT is pressuring them for time too, but not quite as much. The SAT has a reading section, also a grammar section, which they call writing and language, but it's basically the exact same as the ACT grammar section. And then they have 2 math sections. Now here's where some students don't love the SAT. One of the math sections does not allow you to use a calculator. Now, for students who struggle in math, it doesn't mean they can't do it without a calculator, but their confidence might be affected in taking this section. And then they do have a math calculator section right after. And as I said, in both math sections, the SAT does have some written answers as opposed to exclusively multiple choice like the ACT. Now we have 180 minutes to complete 154 questions, so they are a little bit more generous on time. So some students really have a strong preference for one test over the other. Many students will score about the same. In fact, I had a tutoring student just today who she scored literally identically on these tests, but she hated the ACT. Okay, so we're starting with the SAT. Why would you spend 2 or 3 months with a test that you hate more, right? Looking at the way these are scored is also good to see because the test makers, again, they don't make it easy for us. They don't make it out of 100 like we're used to. So the ACT is scored on a scale of 1 to 36. So each section, English, math, reading, and science, are scored on a scale of 1 to 36. And then those sections are averaged to get you a total composite score out of 36. Then we have the SAT. The SAT is probably something we're all more familiar with. You have a verbal section on which you're scored out of a scale of 800 and a math section on which you're scored out of a scale of 800. These are added together to get your total score out of 1600. So some people say that colleges are looking at the ACT cumulative score more total overall, whereas when they're looking at an SAT score, they're looking at the total, but they're also looking at the split a bit more. That's another thing to consider. So then the question that we're asked all the time is, so what's a good score, right? And I could, shout out, what do you think a good score is? My student today, she had a very typical starting score. She had a 530 actually exactly in each section. And her SAT score was a 1060. And I said, okay, so what score do you feel like you need, right? What do you think is a good score? And she said, I don't know, 1250, 1300 maybe, 1350. I said, where are you coming with that information? Why do you think that's a good score? She said, I don't know, right? Because oftentimes they're hearing this, right? This is a good score based on what their older sister got, or what their cousin said, or what their friends, are getting. But what we should base a good score on is the score each individual student needs, right? Every student is applying to a different set of colleges, and what those colleges' average test scores should be what they're goaling themselves for when they're taking the SAT. The student I tutored today, when she looks up, I think Clemson is one of the schools she was interested in, she might find out, oh, I need a 1400 to get there. Or she might look and say, oh, I only need a 1200, right? It really depends. You have to look up every single school and see what their average score is. And many juniors don't know their full list of schools yet. So what I say is recommend going to Naviance, see what, it's recommended to you based on your GPA as the appropriate, average test school for you. And even if you're not interested in that school, you can get a sense of average test scores. Another great website to check out is called bigfuture.org. It is made by the College Board. It is the only thing I like that the College Board makes. But it is also a really good search tool. You could also go on our website, princetonreview.com, to see schools and see average scores. What they'll show you is average test scores for first-year freshmen for that year. So here I have on the screen, and you have it in that bookmark I handed you. It's called a concordance chart. So it shows you how you equate an ACT score to an SAT score, and that's how any college admissions officer can, compare students. If someone submits only ACT and someone else submits an SAT score, they can compare those scores. And you can see here, like about average is about 1,000 or on the SAT or a 20 on the ACT. So the most important takeaway should be a good score is the score that gets you into your dream college. A great score is a score that helps you get some merit aid from that school, right? Even better. So here I have where will your scores take you, and I also have a flyer called where will your scores take you. So what this slide is showing is the average scores to get into these schools, what the most recent freshman class is. So for example, the University of Connecticut. What this is saying is that 50% of students admitted to the University of Connecticut recently had scores between a 1210 and a 1390 on the SAT. So we just pulled a couple of schools from around the country just to give examples, right? You want to be somewhere in that bullseye, right, of the 50%, even better if you're above it. So I don't have any students in the room, but I feel like maybe they're on the live stream. Hopefully they are, and if they are, they need to go to bed soon so they can take the PSAT tomorrow. But I'm gonna go over a couple tricks for the different sections of the test. So the test writers, again, they are not your teachers in your classes. They do not want to see you succeed. The test writers write these tests so that every single time they administer it, they get a curve that looks the same, with most students falling in that average, right? About 1,000 on the SAT or 20 on the ACT. So they'll put a question in like, if x plus 7 equals 10, then what does x plus 5 equal? And so students really quickly might answer and say, oh, well, x equals 3. Done. That's an easy one, right? But was the question actually asking, what does x equal? Or was it asking, what does x plus 5 equal, right? So a simple addition problem, student can get it wrong because they were rushing, right? And of course, the test writers put the trap answers or the partial answers for doing partial work in every time. So common mistakes that students will make: answering questions too quickly. It makes sense, right? You're taking a test, you're trying to get to the end. And when you're trying to get to the end, you rush, and when you rush, you make careless mistakes. And I don't even like that term, careless mistakes, because every student I know pretty much really does care. It's just mistakes, right? We all make mistakes when we're rushing. So choosing answers carelessly, I would think more, sometimes it happens where a student reads an answer choice in the reading section and they just simply don't know that vocabulary word. So they think, oh, I don't know that one, and they cross it off, right? Well, maybe if you don't know it, that might actually be the answer. How about you use the ones that you know, you definitely do know that you can cross off because you know they're wrong first, right? So sometimes students, do things carelessly because they're just trying to get through the question or they're feeling stumped. Another thing that students do a lot when they're rushing or they feel like they have to get through it is they'll do work in their head in the math section. Mental math often leads to errors. Misreading the problem happens a lot simply because the way these questions are worded. And then simply sometimes students just don't understand what to do. They read the question, they reread the question, and they don't understand what the question is asking them because the questions are sometimes not even questions. They're actually half of a sentence, and then the answer choices are options for the other half of it, right? So understanding how the test writers write these questions and the common traps is something we teach a lot. So here's one strategy. Let's say we're in the reading section and we have a passage with 10 questions. Let's say we have run out of time and we got to just get through that. We have like 1 minute to bubble things. If I were to guess the same letter all the way down the line, I just bubble in B for all those, would that be a better strategy than if I bubbled in randomly for those 10 questions? What do you think would be better? Same letter or random? Same? Yeah, exactly. If I bubble in the same letter, odds are I'm going to get a couple of those right. It's got to be a couple times out of 10, right? So that's something important to note. Most students taking these tests should not be fully doing all of the work and trying to finish this test because the test is not made for you to finish it, right? If you instead work smarter and you pace yourself and say, I know I'm going to guess on 10 questions. I'm going to put my favorite letter of the day for those last 10, and I'm going to work hard on all the other ones. Actually have better odds of getting a higher score than if you really work through and try to get to every single problem. So we'll talk a little bit about each section really quick, and then I know you guys are probably tired of letting you out. So for the reading strategy, we have a couple, this is built as a multiple choice question, but it's really not. So for the reading strategy, some common trap things that SAT likes to do. Using extreme language like never or always or all, right? Usually when an answer choice contains that, it's wrong. Or they'll recycle phrases directly from the passage. So you'll think, oh, I remember reading that, right? But it's just recycling a specific line of text. It's not actually getting the meaning correct for the answer to the question. Or they'll say something that's true, but it's just true in real life about that author or about that subject matter, and it's not actually something that was stated in the passage. This is a big way in which students lose points. In English class, you're encouraged to think outside the box a bit and to pull in outside knowledge historically about an author, but on the SAT, you're actually penalized for that. So oftentimes the correct answer is going to be an answer that you might not love in the reading section, but it's still the best answer, or what we like to call the least bad answer. So let's look at a grammar strategy. I don't even know if you guys can see this, but what the grammar question will do is it'll have a chunk of text, and then a piece of it is underlined. So the underlined piece, it's okay, I'm almost done. They said, I don't know, it was your dog before. Yeah. So the underlined piece of text will, must be consistent. You have to check that underlined piece of text to make sure it's consistent with the rest of the text. And you're looking for any grammatical errors. Now, if I look at this myself, I might not even catch the grammatical error, and it really doesn't do me any good to try to edit it on my own. The most important thing to do with the grammar is to go right to the answer choices and ask yourself, what's changing in the answer choices? When I see what's changing in the answer choices, it gives me a hint. The good thing about these tests is they are open book tests, right? There are lots of wrong answers. We have to just find the wrong ones and get down to the right one. So the thing that's changing in the answer choices, let's see, I'll read you the question. So the question says, currently, products that are GMOs of either type is not required to be labeled as GMOs, and is not required is underlined. And then you have three other options: isn't required, are not required, or not required. So if I look at these and ask myself, what's changing in the answer choices? What's changing is the verb. Some of them have is, some have are, right? Well, verbs have to be consistent with their subjects. They have to, right? They have to agree. So I can look in the non-underlined text and find the subject there. So products that are GMOs, products is the subject. And products, is that singular or plural? Plural. So if I have a plural word, I need a verb to match it, right? So is not plural, isn't is not plural, and the last answer doesn't even have a verb in it, right? So I know the answer is are not required. And incidentally, of course, they try to trick you. They put extra text between the subject and the verb, right? It said products that are GMOs of either type, right? Type is singular, so they're throwing in a singular word in the middle just to mess with your head. They're not nice. All right, finally, we will look at a math strategy. So this math question says, a rectangular rug has an area of 80 square feet, and its width is exactly 2 feet shorter than its length. What is the length in feet of the rug? So you can see how they've taken a real world problem and like turned it around in the way that they deliver it, so it's written in a way to confuse it, right? And this is the number 24 in the math section, which means it's getting more challenging. So what our strategy for this would be is to break it down into bite-sized pieces and to recognize that the answer choices are giving us clues. The answers are part of the problem. So we know that they're telling us the rug has an area of 80 square feet. And we know that an area for a rectangular object is length times width. And if we didn't know that, they would actually show that at the beginning of the section, right? So that's nice, key, right? So length times width has got to be 80. My answer choices are all numbers and they're going in order. So that tells me I can use a strategy that we call plugging in the answers. We call it PETA for short. I'm going to just test out their answers, right? But I'm going to be strategic. I'm not going to start with the first one, and I'm not going to start with the last one. Since they're going in order, I'm going to start with the middle. That way, if it's too big, too small, I can decide which way I want to go up, down, and work most efficiently. And I'm going to follow what the problem said. It said, what is the length of the rug, right? So I know the answer choices are options for the length. And the problem also said the width was 2 feet shorter than the length. So I'm just going to follow that. I'm going to start with the middle. Number 16, yeah? You're already guessing your favorite letter of the day. Let's see if it's B. It might be. Okay, it would be easier if you could see this up there. But if C is 16, the length is 16. What's 16 minus 2? You can do that. 14, right? So that would mean the width is 14. 16 times 14, without even having a calculator, is that going to be 80? No. Is it too big or too small? too big. So I'm crossing out C, and I can cross out anything bigger than C. So C, D, and E all go away. Now I'm going to test out B, and guess what? You were right. So 10 minus 2 is 8. 8 times 10 is 80. So the answer is clearly B, and we also know that it's B with 100% certainty. Had I tried to use algebra, which this problem was trying to get me to do, I might not have been as sure of the answer. But when I used this strategy and I could see it very clearly, I know that I got that one right, and that means that's one in the bank. I don't have to worry about, right? I know the number of questions I'm getting right. Okay, I'm not going to make you do any more math. We're just talking about the timeline now. So the SAT and ACT are offered 7 times a year each. So this is good to know, right? The main big picture thing I want you to take away is we want to avoid taking these tests in the fall of senior year, right? By then you should be focusing on your applications, all the different elements of that. So juniors will take it all different times of the year depending on when they're ready. Some students in advanced math are already ready the summer after sophomore year. Some students like to then get done by the fall of junior year. Other students don't take the test until spring of junior year. One thing to keep in mind, parents of sophomores, next year will be the digital SAT offered in the spring. So in the fall, when students who are currently sophomores, in the fall of next year, if they want to take a paper and pencil SAT, they still can in the fall. Starting in the spring of 2024 is when it will exclusively be offered digitally. And the content will be the same, the strategies we'll be teaching will be the same, but so far what we know is it's going to be shorter tests and it's going to be adaptive, and we know a lot more nitty-gritty details, but that's a whole other presentation that I'm happy to come back and deliver. So finally, we can help you get the score you need. There's lots of ways to prep. I already mentioned the practice test is a great way to start. They're free. We have books. You can do the ACT and SAT self-paced course, which is something that actually SACHM students get for free. And then we also have courses. We're offering schedules on campus here. We also have live online schedules. We also have tutoring. All SACHM families get 30% off all of our courses. So that's SAT and ACT courses, as well as AP courses and academic courses. And then you get 10% off tutoring. So again, SAT, ACT, but also AP. We have a lot of score guarantee programs that are very attractive and popular that have a money-back guarantee. And we also have tutoring in academic subjects for students in 6th through 12th grade. All SACHM students get a free 60-minute trial to homework help, which is something also that's useful, and the free practice tests I already mentioned are a great free resource. So I have my contact information here for the folks live streaming. You can scan the QR code if you wanted to have a one-on-one consultation. And then if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
How many times can you take the test?
Great question. So how many times can you take the test? You can take it as many times as you want. College Board and the ACT will take your money every single time. But I wouldn't recommend it, right? I really wouldn't recommend you taking a test more than 3 times. And I really do say plan to take it twice. If you're preparing the right way, that should be all you need. You know, most studies show that students increase the most between that first and second test. But some students, I've definitely had those students who they've gotten that 1390 and they're like, oh, I just want that 1400, you know, and they take it a third time and they get a 1420, you know, so plenty of students do want to take it that third time. Good question. So you can. That's so it's called super scoring, and it's a policy that each school has, not the test makers. So what it means is that when you're filling out an application, it will ask you for your highest score from each test administration date. So let's say I take the March SAT and my verbal score is a 600 and my math is a 550. I put that verbal 600 in, and then I take the May SAT and my math has gone up to a 650 and my verbal stayed the same. I pull that math score for May and that verbal score from March, and now I've got my super score of a 1250.
All schools accept that, or is it certain schools?
Most schools do, but it is a school-by-school individual policy. And ACT started putting a super score on their score reports now automatically for you. No, you can't mix and match them. But you might choose to submit both. Like you might take both tests, and if you score about the same, you want to submit both to show that you're a consistent test taker. You can, absolutely, yeah. Any other questions?
It's a good idea that you get it to her regardless of if you need help or not, but necessarily just help with the overtaking tasks.
Well, so the thing is that the tests, students oftentimes don't realize that the tests are very strategy-based, right? So yes, so taking a course, you're going to focus a lot on strategy. We'll cover content too, or working with a tutor, but the strategies really make a difference. I can say that I've seen them make a difference over and over and over again for 10 years. The one thing I would advise is don't just take a real administration day just to see how you do, right? There's no reason for that. You take a PSAT to see how you would do, or take a free practice test with us to see how you would do. But a lot of times families will just say, oh, well, I just signed them up for March and April just to see, and then they don't really hunker down and study until the right amount. You know, you want to try to plan this the same way you look at junior year, you look at everything. You have to figure out, okay, when can they fit in driver's ed, right? And you know, what extracurricular is my child doing? When is the time of year that they're least stressed, right? When they can focus 2 or 3 months on this, because you don't want this to take up too much time. Your grades are number one most important thing, and that's also what the schools are looking at, especially those junior year grades. So you don't want the tests prep to be too draining or taking too much of their attention. You want it to be the right amount so that they're properly prepared so that they can use these scores to help them. Junior year is 11th grade. You're ahead of the game.
On average, when do kids start taking the prep courses?
So if you're planning, I would say many Sachem students are probably taking the March SAT, that probably the majority of them, that would be their first administration. So those students might start a prep course in December or January, depending. We have an essentials course and we have some schedules. I think I gave you this, right? So that's just to give you a sense since your daughter's a sophomore. But the essential schedule would start in January, so it's 2 months before. We also have our 1400 plus schedules, which we offer online, and those are more intensive. It's 36 hours of class time instead of 18. So we spread it out longer, so they might start in November or December working up to prep them. But all of our courses, end like a week before an official test date, so it's preparing you for that test date.
Is there one earlier than March, like November?
Yeah, so we have, this is the schedule for the year is on this bookmark, and it's pretty much the same every year. So there is a November SAT and a December SAT. Those are the next 2 dates. What's interesting about the SAT is that they then have a break that's pretty big. There used to be a January SAT and they stopped offering it. So now you kind of have to decide whether you're going to prep in the fall or prep in the spring. You don't want to start your prep, in October or November and take one test and then have to keep that stuff in your mind for 3 more months and then take your second test in March, right? It's probably better, like if you know that you're going to, right. So it's better to say, okay, I'm in advanced math. I want to get this out of the way. I'm going to start prepping in August. I'm going to, knock out November, December, I'll be done. Or I'm not in advanced math. I want to get as much math under my belt this year as I can. I'm going to start prepping in January to take the March, May tests. And in either scenario, you still have some wiggle room on the rest of the tests that school year, right? I mean, you could take them in the summer after junior year, and you can still take them in the fall of senior year. I just wouldn't recommend it because you should be focusing on your essays and getting your letters of recommendation, all the application elements that can be really stressful and time consuming. Thank you for coming out.
Thanks so much.
And thanks to anyone who joined online, and we'll share follow-up information for anybody who scanned the raffle QR code or for the folks who joined online.
Thanks so much. Have a nice night.
Thank you. You too. Have a good night.